Welcome, my friends, to the Bob and Brad Podcast. My name is Mike Keenitz, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Ray McClanahan, who is a podiatrist and works at the Northwest Foot and Ankle Center located in Portland, Oregon. He is also the creator of the Correct Toes Toe Spacers, which we will talk about later on in the podcast. Today, we're talking about foot health, how to fix bunions without surgery, heel pain, hammer toes, shin splints, and plantar fasciitis or plantar fasciosis, depending upon what you want to call it. If you are watching this on our main YouTube channel and would like to hear the whole episode, you can find it on the Bob and Brad Podcast's YouTube channel or anywhere else podcasts are streamed. So without further ado, here is Dr. Ray McClanahan. All right, I'm going to get into the meat and potatoes here of the questions. So what type of shoes are best for foot health?
Yeah, so there's probably 4 or 5 broad parameters that are probably going to be helpful for almost everybody listening. And the first feature that I would say is healthful would be having no heel elevation. Dr. Rossi, who I mentioned earlier, used to call it flat. These days, the industry term is zero drop. So in other words, the heel is not higher than the ball of the foot. So that's the feature number 1 to be avoided. And the reason why you want to avoid that is they've done studies where they've taken people in heeled shoes and then flat shoes and then done an MRI on their calf muscles and Achilles tendons. And the study was done on groups of ladies. One group of ladies wore a 2-inch heel. The other went on a flat shoe or a zero drop shoe. Believe it or not, the 2-inch heeled ladies had calf muscles that were 14% shorter. So everybody in podiatry and orthopedics and sports medicine would tell you that a tight calf muscle is a root. A causative element. But what's interesting is I used to have all my runners coming in and all their calves were tight. And so I'd have them stretch and rehab. And then I'd check them a week or 2 later and they're still tight. And I now know why. They would stretch for 10 or 15 minutes, but then they go back into a shoe that the heel was higher. And so they got short again. So they weren't actually gaining anything. So negative number 1 is elevated heel. Negative number 2 that I learned about from Dr. Rossi, I never even heard this term in podiatry school, is called toe spring. So if your audience members look at their shoes from the side and look at where the toe portion of the shoe is, they're going to notice that the ends of the toes will be held above the ball. And that's also not healthful. There's ideas that it's somehow going to help us roll through. And maybe if they have a horrible arthritic joint and you're a very old person, that might be something favorable. But for young people, you need your toes on the ground. And more importantly than that, you need your toes spread out and on the ground. So the third feature that we don't want, which is a fashion feature, is a tapering toe box. So in other words, the ball of the foot will be the widest part of that shoe and it will get narrower. And it doesn't matter if it's a D, E, double E, triple E, it's still a triangle shaped in the wrong way, meaning that believe it or not, and the way that I encourage people to think about this is we're all born with the widest part at the ends of our toes. If you look at the baby footprint at the hospital when we're born, we're all born widest at the tips of the toes. And what's different about us versus cultures like I grew up in Liberia, West Africa, where they don't own shoes, and certainly not the shoes that we wear, the old people are still baby-shaped foot. They're still widest at the tips of the toes. And you don't see bunions over there, and you don't see hammer toes, and you don't see the things that we see here. So elevated heel, toe spring, tapering toe boxes. And then the fourth thing is if the shoe is super stiff, you might not be making best use of all the bones and joints in our feet. And believe it or not, our feet have some of the most bones and joints in our whole body. And they can do some really remarkable things to help us stay upright. They will allow us to have these footwear design features for a long time, and we might not even hurt. But the problem with the elevated heel and the toe spring, the taper, and so forth is eventually our feet learn to be shaped like that. So if you hold your foot like that for long enough, like I did, you take your shoe off and your foot looks like your shoe. So when you wear that toe spring, the muscles, the calf muscles on the front of your leg also get short and tight. So if we wear the heel, the back of our leg's getting short and tight. If we wear the toe spring, the front of our leg is getting short and tight. And this is a huge problem, Mike, because we've got this really complex layer of muscles in the bottom of the foot known as intrinsic muscles. In other words, they're the arch muscles, and they're critically important. But the problem is when we shorten the back of our leg and shorten the front of our leg, those muscles get long and weak. And I know that Brad and Bob are going to appreciate this, because a component of physical therapy is understanding a concept called length to tension relationship. And I learned that relationship from my physical therapy friend Jay DeSherry, who is now out here in Oregon in Bend. He's got a great book, Anatomy for Runners, and he's also recently written another book. I think it's called Running Rewired. But in his first book, he's got some really nice graphics about how if a muscle's too short, it's not functioning optimally. If a muscle's too long, it won't be able to overcome its antagonistic muscles. And that's what most people probably here listening to us, Mike, are doing unknowingly to their own feet. And then I probably would throw in another feature, which would be you don't want your shoe to be heavy, especially if you're an athlete, because they've done some studies where they've looked at the oxygen consumption in people that wear heavy shoes compared to people that wear really lightweight shoes. And think about your leg going behind your body with heavy shoe. You're going to work harder to get that shoe out in front of your body. So that would be another thing to try to avoid. And for the audience, if y'all are interested in this, we've got boatloads of information on the website that does a deep dive on all of this.
Yeah, you guys have a lot of different blogs on these subjects, don't you?
We do. Yeah.
The heavy shoes are kind of funny. I have a friend that bought like these $200 carbon foot plate running shoes, and he's obsessed with them, and I just think they're the funniest things in the world. Because I'm running with my little Minimalist shoes, and we're just like polar opposite, but he swears by them, and I think they're just kind of a joke. But I think I spent like $65 on my shoes.
I like it. That's the other cool. What's that?
Do you have any like brands you recommend? I mean, I know there's tons of companies, but
yeah, we have lots of brands that we recommend. Probably rather than listing them individually, I would direct your audience's attention to our shoe list.
Okay.
And also the website. We've got all these different brands on the website. When Dr. Rossi taught me what I'm sharing here today, I was frustrated because I understood what he knew and what I needed to do for people, but I scoured the community, and there were literally 3 options at that time. So we're talking 1999. The options were Birkenstocks, which obviously you're not going to run in. The other option, surprisingly, was Crocs. And so we did some really wonderful things in Crocs, including I ran my marathon PR here in Portland in a pair of Crocs. And people, I think here in Portland, misunderstood us. I think they thought we were trying to like stand out or make a statement. But realistically, if you look at Crocs, they're basically what I just talked about. They don't have a higher heel. The toes aren't up in the air. You can spread your toes. They're light. So back then, my patients looked at me kind of sideways when I said, yeah, I think you should train for your 10K in your Crocs. But they did. And the ones that trusted in the recommendation in their body did really well. And I wouldn't see them in my office. I would see them at the marathon or out training or in the clubs that we ran in. Or the third option would be get something custom made, which is cost prohibitive usually. Subsequent to that, I'm so thrilled to see a lot of smaller companies finally getting this information. I would say the last I checked, probably last week, there's probably 50 or 60 what I would call natural footwear companies now. And they're not all for sports medicine. Some of them are sandals and some of them are casual shoes. But quite frankly, some of the stuff that would be considered casual shoe might actually work appropriately for athletics, like the Crocs. Another side story, if we have time, Mike, is we have a great race out here in Portland called the Hood to Coast. And it's 200 miles and we get teams of 12. And one year I was on a New Balance sponsored team. And so they sent us all the great gear and they sent us these beautiful racing flats. And at that point, my toes were spaced and I was healthy. And so I put them on and I tried to warm up for my first leg. And immediately I knew I wasn't going to be able to run comfortably in them. So I actually ran the Hood to Coast in a pair of Lems, which is one of the brands that we like. They're out of Boulder, Colorado, and they're not a running shoe. But once your feet are strong and healthy and you understand the principles of what your needs are as an active person, you can start to disavow the idea of shoe categories. You know, the market wants us to believe you need a shoe for hiking and walking and volleyball and pickleball and, recovery and all this kind of thing. But quite frankly, if you understand your feet and your feet are well and the foundation is level, you can get away with a lot of things in non-categorized footwear.
Do you normally have people kind of transition from normal shoes to minimalist shoes?
I'm so glad you brought that up, Mike, because after I outlined the shoe characteristics, I wrote myself a note to make sure and address that, because if there's a danger for anybody in the audience incorporating this, it would be doing it too soon. And there was a book, you may be familiar with, Born to Run.
Oh, Born to Run, yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
that's Run for Your Life behind me. That's a different one.
Yeah, another great book. Dr. Mark is fantastic. The sequel to Born to Run 2 just came out, and I just picked it up this weekend. But when the first one came out, I want to say 2009, 2010, it's a beautiful story about the Indians down in the Copper Canyons of Mexico who come to the Leadville 100 Mile and win it with a sandal strapped to their feet. And so if you're familiar, they went down there and they studied the culture. What are they eating? How are they training? Are they using drugs? What's the deal? And the takeaway really is they have strong, healthy feet, and they always have, and they've never done any of the things to their feet that we've done that weaken us and cause all the arch problems and so forth. So once that book came out, everybody said, wow, this makes sense, and I'm getting rid of my big, heavy shoes, and all of a sudden either went barefoot or went in a minimalist or something along those lines, but too quickly. And I'll give an example of why that's not a good idea. I went snowboarding with my daughters over the weekend and did some new things for 2 days, which aren't harmful, but I did too much of them. And so I'm sore, and the same thing happens with transition of footwear. It needs to be very, very slow and gradual. And there's no perfect formula, which is what makes it kind of difficult when having this conversation. Is if you've got a 15-year-old child and you've got a 65-year-old adult, their transition period is going to look entirely different. Body style, body weight, the footwear they've been wearing their whole lives, what kind of podiatric problems might they currently be having. So yeah, that's probably the most important feature to cover in this whole thing, Mike, is to have success with this. And a lot of people can, if not most people. We have to let our bodies get used to something new. And the irony is that something new is actually something we should not ever have had to relearn.
Yes, something old is something new.
Right. If we could prevent children from running into these issues like most of us do in middle age, then they wouldn't have to take this instruction. They wouldn't have to adapt. It would be just what their body has learned, So the adaptation period, you're right, is critical. And if people do it correctly, most people won't go back to their old shoes. Most people won't go back to their orthotics, need surgeries and injections and medicine.